Hello, my name is Emily Sands, and I am a master's candidate at University College London, working to obtain my master's in global health and development. I wrote this review, a systematic review of PFAS contamination in the Great Lakes Basin in the Ojibwe Nation, in partnership with Loyola University Chicago, and that is what I will be presenting on today. So some background introduction information. Per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS, are a manufactured and chemically stable group of compounds. Due to widespread use, PFAS are present everywhere, in water, soil, air, and inside of our bodies. PFAS are used in firefighting foam, cardboard food containers, including our disposable to-go coffee cups, stain-resisting lining on couches, nonstick pans, and even medical equipment like Teflon linings for hernia surgeries. PFAS contaminants infiltrate everyday items that we have intimate relationships with. The CDC conducted several surveys and found that the majority of people living inside of the United States have been exposed to PFAS. A common characteristic of PFAS compounds is that they do not break down in the environment and can bioaccumulate, which gives rise to their alias, forever chemicals. The two most common PFAS compounds are PFOA, PFOA, and Pfos, PFOS, which are currently being phased out of use and replaced by other PFAS compounds. The current EPA definition for PFAS compounds only includes chemicals with at least two adjacent carbon atoms, where one carbon is fully fluorinated and the other is at least partially fluorinated. There is a gap in the research examining the effects of PFAS contaminants on human health, but currently the investigation points to high levels of exposure contributing to adverse health effects. Moving on and focusing on our indigenous populations, on average, indigenous populations do consume fish at a much higher rate than the national average. This puts them at an elevated risk for the hazards of ingesting contaminated fish. The Ojibwe Nation is located throughout the Great Lakes Basin, mainly surrounding Lake Superior. The Ojibwe fish in Lake Superior and grow rice on its surface, and fishing in the Great Lakes is an integral part of indigenous life, culture, and food sourcing. So to conduct this review, I based my criteria for searching for sources on the overall research question. I searched PubMed, Google Scholar, and news sites for articles published in English from 2004 to March 28, 2022. My mesh terms included per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS, indigenous peoples, Lake Superior, contamination, First Nation, and Ojibwe. My scope included academic peer-reviewed literature and personal accounts and news articles documenting direct experience with PFAS infiltration into the Great Lakes, as well as technical reports made by local institutions and the federal government. I excluded any reference I did not have access to through my university or any article that I could not access promptly. After a preliminary title and abstract screening, I gathered relevant articles based on my criteria. After pulling all sources, the total number of references was 41. I then assessed their eligibility with standards based on each type of source and extrapolated the data. For studies not focusing on human health, the organism studied must be commonly consumed, for example, walleye. Studies must also refer to human health outcomes resulting from a mention of PFAS, POPs, or organohalogen exposure. For non-academic sources, news articles, and government reports, there must be a mention of the impact on Ojibwe health and lifestyle. After examining each source, the total number included in the study is 26. There may be a risk of selection bias, though attempts were made to minimize that in every capacity. I decided to expand my scope of interest to include layman sources to ensure the inclusion of all information on the exposure of the Ojibwe Nation to PFAS compounds. The sources identified indigenous exposure as well as PFAS contamination and concentration on both sides of the Great Lakes, in Canada and the United States. So, looking at our results, 13 sources confirmed my original posit that PFAS accumulation in humans increases due to consumption of highly contaminated fish, especially in the indigenous nations of the Great Lakes region. PFAS contamination most commonly occurs through ingestion. Consumption of Great Lakes fish is associated with a rise in blood concentration of PFAS compounds, namely PFOS, PFOS. PFAS contamination enters the waterways through landfill leaching and industrial discharge. The contaminants are water-soluble and do not biodegrade, meaning that PFAS compounds can remain in the environment for extremely long periods. As contaminated fish are eaten by other predatory fish, the biomagnification of Pfos occurs. So PFAS has been detected in both adults and children, indigenous and non-indigenous. Children and teenagers tend to be more vulnerable to toxicants as they are still experiencing neurological development. Ojibwe Nation teenagers had concentrations of PFAS 3 times higher than other Canadian residents. concentrations of PFAS of Ojibwe populations were even higher than other non-Great Lake Basin First Nation populations like the Innu. Different studies also emphasized a wide variety of potential health effects. Associations found levels of PFAS exposure linked to thyroid, pancreas, and hormone dysfunction. Elevated levels of Pfos compounds in blood have also been linked to increased mortality related to prostate and bladder cancers. Additional associations exist between PFAS prevalence and endocrine disruption. PFAS contamination has also been linked to decreased fertility, ulcerative colitis, and other cancers. PFAS concentrations could also induce concentration-dependent cytotoxicity and depletion of the glutathione levels. The liver is considered the main target of PFAS, as a study found that PFAS induced liver tumors in rodents. PFAS exposure has also been found to disrupt embryonic development. In assessing PFAS health effects, sex may be a confounding factor along with age, as males had higher concentration of PFAS than females, and multiple studies confirm that PFAS concentration increased with age as older women had higher concentrations. PFAS contamination impacts childbirth and rearing in Indigenous communities at a higher level than in non-Indigenous nations. As the mean age of childbirth increases, so does the burden of PFAS in the next generation. The exposure of pregnant Indigenous women to PFAS, a Pfos compound, increased from 2004 to 2017. Breastfeeding rates are low in the Ojibwe Nation due, in part, to mixed messaging about the importance of breastfeeding and the increasing information from the scientific community that PFAS are expelled through breast milk. Parents are then forced to decide whether to forego the essential nutrients found in breast milk or protect their children. Yet, PFAS is often found in contaminated waterways near Indigenous nations, making it nearly impossible to protect young children from contamination even if parents choose to bottle feed. This phenomenon is not unique to the Ojibwe or to the Great Lakes Basin. Indigenous peoples in the Arctic also face a higher burden of bioaccumulated contaminants than other populations, with Indigenous mothers reporting the highest concentrations of persistent organic pollutants. Systemic discrimination and environmental racism force Indigenous populations to face higher than average exposures to persistent organic pollutants, and therefore they are at a higher risk to develop increased adverse health effects. Exclusionary social and land policies, sponsored by unjust treaties, perpetuate multi-generational poverty and stress. Indigenous lands are popular places for waste landfills, military testing, nuclear storage, industrial plants, and mines, as corporations are not subject to the same environmental regulations and oversight as areas under state jurisdiction. The environmental racism and targeting of Indigenous lands by polluters put Indigenous communities, including the Ojibwe nations, at a higher risk of PFAS contamination than other non-Indigenous Americans. So overall, the 26 studies I found and researched for this literature review support that adverse health effects exist for Ojibwe peoples exposed to PFAS contaminants. However, more research needs to be conducted to gain a more comprehensive understanding of both short and long-term health and cultural impacts of exposure. There's a general lack of United States studies on Indigenous exposure to PFAS compounds. Most of the research is centered in Canada, looking at exposure to First Nation peoples in the Arctic. There were several strengths of the studies incorporated in this review that bolster the strengths of the associations that I just cited. Of the studies included, several are prospective in nature, using the collection of longitudinal data to provide strong evidence to establish the plausibility of a causal relationship between past exposure and current health effects. Non-cohort studies also stratified their data to avoid confounding and any other disruptions to previously discussed associations. Another strength of this review is the inclusion of non-academic sources. This ensures a full scope of the issue was discussed and that this review includes an accurate depiction of the human cost of PFAS contamination of Indigenous land. Additionally, many of the included studies were conducted in partnership with local tribal entities to ensure ethical practices. There are limitations to this review as well, and to the individual studies included. Multiple studies are cross-sectional in design, which present the possibility of unauthentic associations between exposure and disease outcome. Each study is, of course, also subject to biases, selection bias, information bias, and possible confounding, though the studies that I chose to be a part of this review took all steps to minimize biases. Another limitation of this review is the lack of comprehensive research on the issue. Further research is necessary, especially United States-based research on our local Indigenous communities. A common theme throughout all the sources was the proposal of consumption advisories for different contaminated fish species in the Great Lakes. None of them, however, included recommendations for culturally sensitive consumption advisories, and very few included regulation recommendations. By enforcing consumption limits without proper regulation, Indigenous communities are losing meals and cultural heritage. Advisories should consider the cultural importance of the food sources they are creating warnings for. Currently, governments are telling Indigenous nations to stop harvesting without understanding cultural importance or offering an action plan. Regulation to curb PFAS contamination of the Great Lakes and all other waterways would protect our Indigenous neighbors from further harm and ensure respect for their traditions. Ojibwe nations and other Indigenous nations face unprecedented health risks for PFAS exposure compared to other populations. Moving forward, lawmakers, researchers, and the populace need to be more insistent on following the precautionary principle, taking time to understand contaminants and chemicals before releasing them into widespread commercial use and into the environment. There's no current national legislation halting the use of PFAS or providing guidelines on PFAS use and exposure. The EPA released their 2021-2024 PFAS Strategic Roadmap, but that's merely a guide for national engagement rather than regulation and policy. The roadmap is a step in the right direction, but it does not go far enough to address community concerns. To protect not only Ojibwe nations but all Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, it is the opinion of this review that comprehensive legislation needs to be enacted. Nationwide safety standards need to be set to safeguard vulnerable populations. Because PFAS safety standards vary from state to state, with the majority not having any enforceable limits, all people face an incredibly high risk of PFAS contamination. Further research needs to be done to determine the lowest observable adverse effect level among males, females, and a variety of age groups. The reference dose, the best estimate of daily exposures for humans resulting in no significant risk, and the no observable adverse effect level needs to be established for all existing and emerging PFAS compounds as well. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you enjoyed this presentation. If you have any questions or would like any further information, please don't hesitate to contact me. You can do so at my email, which is emily, emily.sands, sands.22 at ucl.ac.uk. Thank you so much.